Okay, so at the end of quarter one here, we are going to kind of look forward to quarter two. And for us, most of quarter two is going to be about the American Revolution. So the lead up to the War of Independence and the War of Independence itself. The very first project of quarter one is going to be on the Boston Massacre, and then we're going to roll forward towards the War for Independence. And by the end of quarter number two, we will be living in a new America. So, for the end of quarter one here, we've just finished up the French-Indian War. We've discussed the fact that the French-Indian War and the 7 Years' War in general have left the British greatly in debt. They need to round up some cash, and they need to do it quick. So they are going to find a way to tax the colonists. They fought for the colonists. They fought to protect the British colonists from the French and those hostile natives. And because of that, they believe that the colonists should have to pay their fair share. And the way they go about raising this money is by starting to, raise taxes. So the Proclamation of 1763 was signed by King George III of England. It prohibited any English settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. It required those already settled in those regions to return to the east in an attempt to ease tension with the Native Americans. So if they can get people back into a consolidated area in what's pretty much those original colonies, it makes it easier for them to protect them. It makes it cheaper for them to protect them. And it also makes it easier for them to find them and tax them. The more spread out you get, the more difficult it is to find you and collect the money that they want from you. So the response to the Proclamation of 1763 is pretty obvious. The colonists resented not being able to settle west of the Proclamation line, especially in places like the Ohio Valley, which is what they had just fought so hard for. The French were now gone. The colonists believed, hey, we were here, we fought for it, we chased off the French. The natives, they don't have a right to it. And again, I want to point out that this is not my slideshow. I have borrowed it from another educational website. Thank you very much. I would not use the word Indians quite so cavalierly, but they choose to do so. So we have these various acts. One of them is the Sugar Act of 1764. The Sugar Act was passed by Parliament to pay for the war debt brought on by the French-Indian War and to help pay for the expense of running the colonies. So what did this act do? It increased the duties. So duties are a tax on goods. It increased the duties on imported sugar and other items such as textiles, coffee, wines, and indigo. Indigo is a dye. I believe gives things a purple or blue color. It's very popular at the time. And sugar, of course, is a big deal because sugar goes in everything. I mean, it makes food and drink taste good. So if you were Britishy and you were drinking tea, you needed that sugar for your tea. And if you were more American and you were drinking coffee, you needed that sugar for your coffee as well. It also increased the tax on wines, and you just don't screw with people's alcohol, ladies and gentlemen. It's not the thing to do. Stamp Act of 1765. So this is a little more complicated, okay? Because a Stamp Act sounds like, well, just don't mail any letters, but that's not what a Stamp Act was. In March, the Stamp Act was passed by Parliament, imposing the first direct tax on the American colonies to offset the high costs of the British military in America. So for the first time in the 150 years of the British colonies in America, the Americans will pay taxes not to their own local assemblies in America, but directly to England. So this tax would go directly back to the king in England. And a little explanation here, again, like I said, it's not just stamps. It's not about mailing letters. Anything that's printed, all these paper materials, has to have a stamp that you have to pay for it to be legal. So newspapers, pamphlets, bills, legal documents, licenses, almanacs, and even dice and playing cards. Anything that's a printed material needs to have this stamp on it, and you have to pay the tax to get the stamp. So the response to the Stamp Act, again, pretty obvious. The American colonists quickly united in opposition, led by the upper class of colonial society, lawyers, publishers, landowners, shipbuilders, and merchants. And you got to remember, these are the people who were most affected by the act. The laborers probably weren't doing a lot of reading or writing. They didn't need to pay the taxes much. So the fact that this Stamp Act affected the most educated and professional people in the colonies was a really, really good sign that it was going to get some powerful people riled up. The Sons of Liberty were founded in Boston. They were an anti-English organization, and they featured famous American Sam Adams, and they led actions against tax collectors. There's a great video I'm going to show you next quarter from the HBO series John Adams, where the Sons of Liberty attack and tar and feather a tax collector. So the Stamp Act was actually repealed in 1766. It didn't last, but the Declaratory Act was passed. And the Declaratory Act, it said that Parliament can tax and make decisions for colonies in any and all cases. So it's like, hey, we pulled the Stamp Act back, but we're saying just because we pulled the Stamp Act back, it doesn't mean we think we can't have laws like the Stamp Act. We absolutely can. We get to make all the decisions, not you. So we'll take this one back. You win kind of on this one, but we're going to be coming back with other things, and you can't argue with us. And of course, our response to that was, hey, this wasn't just about the Stamp Act. This is about us having representation. So the Sons of Liberty and the rallying cry they had was no taxation without representation. In 1767, the English Parliament passed something called the Townshend Revenue Acts, imposing a new series of taxes on the colonists to pay for the costs of the American colonies. Now, keep in mind, this is how the British are phrasing everything. All of these taxes are to pay for the costs of the American colonies. None of these taxes are to pay off the British war debt anywhere else in the world. All of these taxes, according to the British, are just to pay for the costs of the American colonies. But at this point, the trust between the colonists and the British, it started to erode. It's a bad situation. So, according to the Townshend Acts, items that were going to be taxed included imports such as paper, tea, glass, lead, and paints. I want you to think about that for half a second. Before, we're taxing the sugar that goes in the tea. That got people riled up. Now we're taxing the tea itself. Imagine how that is going to go over. The answer is not very well. The act also established a colonial board of customs commissioners in Boston. So again, there's a tax placed on American tea. It allows the British East India Company to monopolize tea sales, the only tea colonists could purchase. It outraged colonists as their tea sellers lost sales and profits. So the easy option here would be, hey, I'm just not going to drink tea anymore. But of course, that's not something they could do. By giving the British East India Company this free monopoly on tea sales, they can kind of charge whatever they want. And it really hurt the local businesses yet again. And that's the thing. Everything the British is doing is hurting it's hurting the colonists twice. Okay, it's costing them money by having them pay the tax, and it's also limiting their options and limiting their freedom. So it's kind of like a slap in the face, and as you're recovering from the first slap, they slap you again just to make sure you understood. So the colonists' reaction, not very good. They start boycotts and petitions. It's like, hey, if we're going to have to pay more for your product, if you're going to limit our choices in purchasing a product, well, then guess what? We're going to boycott, and we're just not going to buy that product. They would create non-importation agreements. They would claim a violation of rights and illegal searches. There would be protests. You see in the right-hand side of this, it's an image of a tax collector being tarred and feathered. Like I mentioned, you'll see in the John Adams video next quarter. And actions against tax collectors, including that tarring and feathering. That's a very, very unpleasant thing. So the most famous response to the Townshend Acts were John Dickinson's essays, Letters from a Farmer, which argued against taxing for the purpose of raising revenue, money, or income. And to enforce the tax laws, they came up with the Quartering Act. And this is where you can tell it wasn't going to go well. To enforce the laws, they need soldiers. All right, there's no standing British police force. You need British Army regulars. They need to be in these major cities, and they need to be enforcing the taxes. Okay, so that there's a hammer to go with the carrot. The carrot is, if you pay the taxes, we keep protecting you. The hammer is, if you don't pay the taxes, we maybe start hurting you. But here's the thing, okay? Armies cost money. You need somewhere for the army to stay. You need something for the army to eat. You need a way for them to survive. And if the British were going to be covering that expense themselves, they would just have to raise taxes again. And since they're having a hard time collecting those taxes in the first place, there's no guarantee that that would work. So what they decide, and this was brilliant, they decide to pass the Quartering Act, which says that these British soldiers are going to stay in colonial homes. So they're going to be quartered there. They're going to live there in those living quarters. So British soldiers will stay in colonial homes. And what's more, the colonists, they're going to have to pay to keep the soldiers there. So they're going to pay for the food. They're going to pay for the living expenses to keep that soldier living in their own house. So a soldier that they don't want and who is only there to enforce a tax against them, they're also going to have to pay for that person to stay. Remember when I said it's like getting slapped once and then they slap you as soon as you recover to make sure that they know you mean business? That's exactly what's happening here. The British are taxing you. You're refusing to pay the taxes. So they're sending soldiers to make sure you pay the taxes. And oh, by the way, the soldiers are going to live with you and you have to pay for everything they do. And that is what creates the climate that leads to the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770, when a mob of colonists harassed a bunch of British soldiers who then, in fear, fired their muskets into the crowd, killing 3 people and mortally wounding 2 others and injuring many, many people. And that is where we're going to pick up in quarter